Gilead, the maker of experimental coronavirus drug remdesivir, is giving investors more details. The company said it plans to expand manufacturing of the drug. It spent $50 million on remdesivir research and development in the first quarter, focused on making the drug accessible and affordable. Joining us now, Daniel O'Day, CEO of Gilead Sciences, and our own Meg Tirrell stays with us. Mr. O'Day, thank you for being with us this morning. You've seen a couple of instances where the entire stock market it surges based on news that comes out about this drug remdesivir. So the importance of it and the relevance of it, I don't think can be overstated. Can you tell us what happened this week, why that was significant? As you pointed out, it hit its primary endpoint, and it did it on the shorter trial, which doubles the amount that you have ready to go, since instead of 10 days, it could be 5 days. Both of those things were important?
Yeah, very important, Joe. First of all, thanks for having me on. I really do appreciate it. And, on behalf of all the colleagues at Gilead that have been working day and night, this is a really important week for us to see these two study results. So there are basically two studies that were announced this week, the results of those. One was the gold standard placebo-controlled trial from the NIH that was part of our suite of studies to determine whether remdesivir would be safe and effective against the COVID-19 virus. And the second one was a study that Gilead ran to look at the difference between 5 days and 10 days of dosing. Both read out positive, and what that means is that remdesivir significantly reduces the recovery time for patients, again in the hospitalized setting we're talking about, and that many patients in the hospital can benefit from a 5 versus a 10-day dosing course, which means a number of things. It's obviously a benefit for patients, but also for the healthcare system, because if you can free up hospital beds at this time, that's absolutely fundamental. So, we're just humbled and pleased by the results this week as a starting point for therapies in COVID-19.
As a starting point, and that's something that's been pointed out, and our own Dr. Scott Gottlieb has pointed out, because it is showing it's active against the virus. Is it going to be similar, in your view, to the experience with some of the other viruses it's been tested on, whether it's SARS or MERS or even Ebola, where it did show activity, but maybe an antibody drug in conjunction with it would actually be more powerful in dealing with the disease? Do you expect it to be one arrow in an arsenal of therapeutics, or much better than that?
Well, we're hopeful. I think these are really significant results on their own, I would say. And we're not done yet. So we have trials that will read out in more moderate patients in May to determine whether we can have an impact even earlier in the disease course for hospitalized patients. But as you say now, the NIH and we were pivoting to now new clinical ideas in terms of antivirals being one way to treat this disease. Could it be supplemented and complemented by different mechanisms being used alongside that? We have a playbook in antivirals that shows that oftentimes combinations of medicines is exactly one needs to take the next step in terms of treatments. So we're going to be focused on both those things, expanding the utility of remdesivir to patients earlier and potentially through different formulations, and then looking at how remdesivir might be able to be complemented by other medicines.
And earlier might work, since it's not really attacking the problem of the late-stage patients with the cytokine storm or whatever. It's viral replication early on. So if it was given earlier, it might even work better than what you've seen with some of the more the diseases that have already progressed more in people.
Well, that's right, Joe. And I think, it's, maybe it's a little bit of a surprise to us that this medicine also worked quite well late in the disease course as well. So, many of these patients in the NIH trial were on mechanical ventilation. We know around 30%. So those are the most severe patients. And interestingly, remdesivir had an effect. Well, we've seen the totality of the data. Of course, we'll see that data being broken out by subgroups in the coming weeks, I'm sure. But the point is, yes, one would think that it might also work even better earlier in the disease. But I think the surprise is that it also works late in the disease. And I think that's something that is has a big impact for patients, of course, with so many hospitalized patients in such great need.
Meg?
Well, thanks, Joe, and hi, Dan. You mentioned that two studies read out this week. There was, of course, that third one from China, the incomplete trial where they couldn't finish the enrollment because case numbers were declining. The full results were reported in The Lancet this week. And a lot of folks are focused on those results, even though that trial wasn't finished and it wasn't a positive study. And one thing that analysts are really homing in on is the fact that it doesn't appear that the drug showed an effect on the viral load in that trial. How are you interpreting those data and putting them into the full context of what effect remdesivir has?
Yeah, thanks, Meg. I know there has been some confusion out there, and I hope I can clear it up a little bit. From our perspective, we see tremendous consistency across all the data that we've seen so far in remdesivir, and that includes data that we had from our compassionate use programs, as well as data from the inconclusive China trial, and then now on to, if you like, the validated data, the most important data that we've seen this week from two randomized trials this week, which I think really trumps, even that other data earlier on. But just to make sure we kind of set the record straight on this as well, I mean, the clinical program was designed to be a suite of studies. So 2 placebo-controlled studies, 1 an investigator study in China, and 1 the NIH trial, and then a combination of open-label trials that were designed to answer different questions, like could you use a 5-day treatment course versus a 10-day treatment course. The China trial, maybe fortunately, but unfortunately from a scientific standpoint, didn't recruit the number of patients it hoped to recruit. In fact, it was about halfway recruited when the disease in China was contained. For great news for patients. But the result of that is you have an inconclusive trial. I mean, you really can't make interpretations from that trial. But when one looks into the trial, you saw some of the same trends that you saw in the NIH trial. So you saw around an early but inconclusive 23% improvement in patients' time to recovery, whereas in the NIH trial we saw, a validated statistical improvement of 30%. So I think it's important to put that into context, and I really do think one has to turn their attention to the trials that did complete and that did have the full patient dose. Now, to your point on the antiviral component of this, there's still so much about this disease we're still learning. And what's clear in some other work that we've done also with the NIH is that the sampling of how the virus activity is going may not be the best predictor of clinical outcome. In other words, sampling, the virus in the nose and nasopharyngeal passageway may not be indicative of what's going on in the lungs. So I think we still have to learn a lot about this disease. And in any case, the most important thing is, are patients getting better? And patients are getting better with remdesivir in this hospitalized, very serious situation. So that's what we're focused on, and now we're focused on building on that early convincing data.
Right, and as you build on the data, you're also undertaking a massive effort to increase supply of this medicine, something you began months ago, even before knowing how well it worked in this disease. This is a very complex drug to manufacture and takes a long time. And we understand that your scientists have already been able to shorten those timelines. But there was a note from RBC out yesterday suggesting, by their modeling, Gilead will only be able to supply enough to cover U.S. patients with COVID-19. How are you looking at the ability to supply the globe with this drug, and what kinds of pressures are you already feeling from governments?
Well, let me first of all acknowledge the tremendous work of the scientists at Gilead. It's only been 3 months since we kind of became aware of this virus, and we immediately pivoted our attention to the clinical trial work and to the manufacturing and supply work, completely understanding that we didn't know whether the medicine worked, but that if it did work, we would need a lot of supply. And so what our scientists did actually in the past 3 months is took, as you mentioned, a very exacting, comprehensive chemical process that is 20 to 30 steps, and much of it has to be done sequentially and not in parallel. They took it from a 12-month start to finish time and brought it down to a 6-month start to finish time. And that's allowed us to have this kind of exponential growth in supply in the second half of this year because we took those actions already in January. So we are focused on making sure on a global basis that this medicine gets into the patients that need it. And we're focused on how best to allocate the medicine in these days, and then how to convert that to an allocation when we have more supply. But the supply that we have in our hands right now, the 1.5 million vials of remdesivir, which equates to around 100 to 200,000 patient courses, depending on whether it's a 5 or 10-day treatment, we will completely donate. We didn't want anything to get into the way of this medicine getting into the hands of patients, and that donation is a global donation. We will work with countries and healthcare systems around the world as they make this medicine available to their citizens based upon their regulatory requirements to do our best to make sure we can allocate that accordingly, and then come up with the right plan for how we then move from these hundreds of thousands of treatment doses to millions of treatment doses. But this is a global pandemic. It's a global problem, and we understand our responsibility here.
And I know you've said it's too early to say where you're thinking about pricing this after that initial donation. You told analysts on your conference call last night there's no playbook for this. We've never seen anything like this in the history of our existence or our lives on this planet. But you are investing up to $1 billion in remdesivir this year in manufacturing and in the clinical trials. And your stock was downgraded by 3 different analysts today based on the lack of visibility into revenue from remdesivir. I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how you, as the CEO of this huge publicly traded company that is now trying to serve the world its first drug that works for this pandemic, how do you balance those pressures from Wall Street and providing this drug in a pandemic?
Yeah, Meg, I think it's a very natural thing at Gilead for us to be able to be focused on access and affordability and making sure that patients in both the developed and the developing world and finding creative ways to get this medicine to patients. I mean, if you look at the history of this company with HIV, decades ago when they took different approaches to get the HIV medicines to the developing world than they did to the developed world, those are the same lessons we'll put to work as we think about the right sustainable model to make sure that we can both invest in the future manufacturing and the additional research that needs to go along with determining whether this medicine can get to different patients, perhaps different formulations that can allow us to go earlier into other parts of the world easier. So we understand our responsibility both to patients and also to shareholders, and we'll be balancing that. It's early days, right? I mean, it's been 3 days since we've got the clinical trial results. We need to digest those. We need to understand what patient populations this is best going to serve. We need to understand how the regulatory process will occur throughout the world. We need to understand where this pandemic will go and how many patients will need to be treated with this. Those are all very, very important inputs to determining the model that we will move going forward. So I can tell you we take our responsibility very serious towards patients, and we understand our responsibility as a company as well and to our shareholders. We will deliver that answer and that information as we can process this information, as we can find the best way forward, I assure you.
Hey, Daniel, as you know, the world looks at a drug like this, and you saw even just the way the stock market reacted the day that the report came out, as new sense of confidence, this idea that people will feel more comfortable, hopefully in the future, knowing that if they were to get this, that they may be able to get protected or at least not have some of the dire consequences that we know so well about. Currently, this has to be used in a hospital setting. You've talked about that several times. You've also, though, made this reference to other formulations. And I was hoping you could speak to that, whether this could ever be in a pill form. We've heard, obviously, that maybe it could be put in an inhaler form, and how quickly you think any of that kind of work can get done, because to the extent that this could be done outside of a hospital setting, that would be a material game changer, even beyond the game changer that you've created already.
Well, yeah, thank you. I mean, we're really focused on making sure that the IV dose, which is the dose and mechanism by which the clinical trials read out this week, that we scale that up and that we get that, focused and out to patients in need. But at the same time, the same way that our scientists back in January started to think about manufacturing and increasing that supply, we also started to think about, should this be effective, what are other ways that we might be able to deliver this medicine to patients? It's still early days on that, and we hope to have some information relatively soon. But because of the nature of this medicine, it's not appropriate for a pill formulation because this is heavily metabolized in the liver, which means that, it's not suitable for an oral dosage form to be able to get the type of levels in the body that you need to suppress the virus. However, looking at subcutaneous formulations, looking at potentially inhaled formulations that get it right to the source of the massive viral replication in the lungs is something that we're firmly focused on now. And again, Gilead scientists are some of the best in the world at taking, chemistry processes and determining the best way to move those formulations along, and then our medical doctors find the best way to treat those. So we should have some more information on that shortly, but I want to make sure that doesn't distract from what our really primary focus is right now, which is to make sure we ramp up the supply for the intravenous medicine, get that in hospitals around the world, make that available for patients that are in severe need at the tail end of the process of the virus replication in their body.
Hey, Daniel, I want to say, first of all, thank you for taking your responsibilities so seriously, for agreeing to donate so much of this up front and make sure it gets to the right places. You are thinking all the right ways about doing this. However, we've never seen something like this where the globe basically gets shut down, countries everywhere dealing with the fallout from that. And I just think this might be a little different than what we've seen at other times with HIV or any other disease that had been taken on before. I know you have manufacturing and supply chains in different places. I just wonder if you can explain where that is, where you need these critical components from, and whether any country has moved to try and say you're going to help us first.
Well, that's a really important point, and we've already begun that process, and we need to continue it. But that is, and we've learned lessons, by the way, from other pandemics and outbreaks like with influenza, that it's extremely important to make sure that you have a very robust supply chain with a lot of duplication in it. Meaning that we have to think about having a supply chain that's global, that provides end-to-end manufacturing in different parts of the world. And we're working, of course, with lots of partners on this. This isn't something that Gilead does on its own. We're grateful to have relationships with high-quality manufacturers and chemical and pharmaceutical manufacturers around the world, as well as other biopharma companies that have stepped up to the plate and reached out to us and asked how they can help. It's been so impressive to see how the bio and pharma community has come together here and dropped what they're doing to see if there's anything we can do to help with this virus. And I'm very proud to be working with the colleagues in this industry that are doing everything from treatments to vaccines and really dropping everything to get there. So this is critically important for us, and we are scaling up that global supply chain right now. And it's exactly what we're going to need to be able to be successful to meet the demands of the patients around the world.
But Daniel, has any country come forward and tried to put the screws to you to say you've got to deal with us first and our population first?
Well, thankfully, we've spoken with a lot of countries around the world. We have a terrific relationship here in the United States as well. I can only say that the government officials that we've been working with have been bending over backwards from regulatory to supply to distribution here in the United States and around the world. I've been amazed at the outpouring of, obviously, interest, but also support. So the types of discussions that I've been having with individuals around the world are productive conversations. They're conversations saying, how can we help? How can we expand the supply chain in our part of the world? Really focused on patients, which I think is important. Those are the types of conversations that I'm having these days.
Hey, Daniel, just one quick follow-up. Given that you're going to be donating this drug, at least in the beginning, what do you think should be the business model for all the other drug companies out there that are working on these endeavors?
Well, I think that's exactly the question that we're asking ourselves. And Meg mentioned it before. I think there is no playbook for this situation that we're in today. I think this is the time for us all as an industry, and certainly Gilead, to do the right thing. And the right thing is to make sure that we can get effective medicines to patients. It means that we also then have to transition to a sustainable model that allows us to manufacture this successfully, that allows us to make sure that we can continue the investments. I mean, the reason that we're so ready today is because of decades of investment. I think that's really important to point out. Remdesivir's story starts 10 years ago. Gilead's story starts 3 decades ago in terms of its experience in antivirals. But we were ready. The important thing is that this is not an issue of taking something off the shelf. This is something where we had invested in the science behind emerging viruses, where we tested remdesivir in a variety of different viruses as they came along. And thankfully, because of the broad antiviral nature of this virus, when we tested it against the coronavirus family, so SARS and MERS, we saw very strong activity of this in the lab. And then we saw it also with COVID-19. So we were prepared for this. But that preparation takes investment, and it takes scientific know-how and knowledge built up. And so I do believe that a sustainable model for this is the reason we're prepared today at Gilead and as an industry. And that's something we have to factor into as we think about how to get these medicines to patients around the globe.
Dan, as we've heard from a lot of your peer companies this week on their earnings conference calls, there is some hope from people in the pharmaceutical industry that their work on this pandemic will reset the public's opinion of your industry from one that has really precipitously dropped over the past few decades. As you talk about these new pricing models, do you think that there is going to be a resetting of how the industry thinks about pricing drugs in general, as you do aim to regain the public's trust?
Well, let me say, Meg, too, I can't be more proud to work in this industry. I feel privileged to have worked in an industry that has made such a difference to patients, that's really literally cured different forms of cancer. In the case of Gilead, cured hepatitis C and turned HIV into a chronic illness. And now the ability to make an impact on a global pandemic. So I know I speak on behalf of all the colleagues at Gilead that we are just extremely proud to be working in this industry. And at the same time, I recognized and acknowledged the fact that from a public sentiment standpoint, we have work to continue to do. It's a complex system around the globe in terms of how our medicines obtain access and get reimbursed in the world. And I do think that we all are aware of our responsibility here. Making sure that patients don't feel the burden of their prescriptions is something that we at Gilead are very focused on, working with healthcare systems and governments to find ways for that to work. And I do believe that at this time, when we see the output of the research-based pharmaceutical industry, it's a time for us to make sure that we communicate the investment that we put into these, the access programs we have, and then thoughtfully, come up with pricing models and reimbursement models that allow us to make sure those medicines get in the hands of patients and also allow us to continue to invest in that type of research that produced remdesivir in the first place.
And Daniel, it could have a positive effect in other ways too, in that some of the misguided knee-jerk proposals that we have about maybe, bringing back price-controlled drugs from over in Europe where they have no innovation left because they aren't able to get it, they aren't able to recoup their investments. If the industry is able to help here in a big way, maybe we'll realize it's much better to develop drugs than it is to have people in hospitals for months at a time in terms of our healthcare needs. And we need the innovation, we need the patent protection. Companies need to be able, if they spend $2 billion developing something, they need to be able to recoup their investment for their investors as well. We've lost sight of that. Even with the Trump administration seems to lose its way at times about what really makes sense to make sure we have innovation in the future.
Well, I mean, Joe, I just think it's absolutely fundamental. This industry has produced such a benefit for patients, but also for the healthcare system. I mean, when you cure diseases, when you turn diseases into chronic manageable illnesses, you have a big impact upon the healthcare systems. And, I think, that's at the core of what we do at Gilead. I mean, our ability to focus on transformational medicines, to focus on the science, to disproportionately invest in research and development is exactly what it's all about. And yes, we have work to do with policymakers around the globe to remind them of the nature of how that works, the significant capital investment at risk, the fact that 90% of everything that we take into human beings fails. You have to have a strong will and a lot of optimism to work in this industry. Again, I'm proud to work in it. The model works. When you disproportionately invest and when you have patent protection for a limited period of time after you make those investments. And I'm really proud of what Gilead has done here with remdesivir. It's again, it's just a privilege to be a part of this.
Well, it's a privilege to have you on today, too, and update us on all this. And hopefully we can see you with an update, soon. We'd like to hear it. And whenever, as this moves along, where the entire world is watching. Thank you, Daniel O'Day. And Meg Tirrell, thank you.
Thank you.